Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to see some well-known faces, especially Darshan Naidu. Sorry, Darshan, for calling you out. Wonderful to have you with us. We are ready to go. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to see if more people join us. But thank you so much for joining again. We'll probably start in about 2 minutes. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy Linfield. I am the I just made myself the executive director. I am the director of the Mandela Institute here at Wits University, which is attached to the School of Law. And it is my great pleasure today to welcome you to this online webinar presented by the Executive Director of Section 27, Sasha Stevenson, on a matter that is very close to my heart: accountability, corruption, and the right to health. So the direction in which I want to take the MI is to understand what I call predatory and parasitic social systems that prevent people of Africa from realizing their full potential. And corruption is one of these systems. And in the case of some of the, case studies that we will talk about today, it's systems that have become cancerous. They destroy what has been, what they feed on eventually. So I'm very excited that Sasha agreed to do this seminar. Thank you so much. And to introduce her, I'm going to hand over to senior researcher in the Mandela Institute, Dr. Sanya Samtini. Thank you, Sanya, for agreeing to host the event today. Handing over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Tracy Lynn. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to all of you Sasha Stevenson. Sasha is someone who, in my opinion, is one of South Africa's foremost activist public health lawyers, the executive director of Section 27, which is a public interest law organization in Johannesburg. Sasha holds bachelor's, honors, and law degrees from Rhodes University and an LLM from the University of Cambridge. Sasha has been working for over a decade to secure systems change that realizes health and food rights, including through representing the families of mental health care users who died after their disastrous deinstitutionalization from Life Esidimeni, securing the restart of the program that feeds 9.6 million children at school every day after COVID-19, and significant work on migrant health, access to abortion, and access to medicine, amongst others. As I said, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sasha to all of you. I've worked with Section 27 before as a consultant, and the work that they do there is really excellent. And today we're going to be discussing the relationship between the constitutional right to health and critical recent developments that raise important questions of accountability, good governance, and corruption. So Sasha, that's enough from me. Over to you. Please begin whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sanya and Tracy Lynn, and thanks to the Mandela Institute for this invitation today. It's a great pleasure to be talking about, I think, one of the really difficult and important issues of the time. As everyone knows, and as everyone has seen in the past few years, health is particularly susceptible to corruption. There's lots of procurement, there are many role players, there's complex goods and services, And importantly, there are big budgets. Transparency International has noted that the diversity of health systems worldwide, the multiplicity of parties involved, the paucity of good record keeping in many countries, and the complexity in distinguishing among corruption, inefficiency, and honest mistakes make it difficult to determine the overall costs of corruption in this sector around the globe. And I think the susceptibility of the health sector to corruption is perhaps nowhere more evident than in this province, Gauteng. The Gauteng province's health department, despite being located in the center of the economy, the home of the national government and of the constitutional court, with a per capita GDP more than twice the size of the next richest province and a provincial budget to match, has long been a cesspool of not just maladministration, but also corruption. By my count, over the past 15 years, there have been 10 MECs in Gauteng Health and 10 HODs, and I may have been missing some. Of these, at least 2 HODs and 2 MECs have been directly implicated in corruption, and others have been suspended or resigned due to other scandals. Scandals and corruption allegations have not stopped supposedly disgraced politicians and accounting officers from the department continuing to serve on the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, going for public walks with the president, or teaching the ANC's political leadership school. The scale of corruption in Gauteng Health has been absolutely eye-watering. Front of mind, of course, for all of us at the moment is the Tembisa Hospital looting and the murder of Tembisa Hospital. We know from the SIU report released just a few weeks ago that at least 2 billion rand was stolen through the hospital in a matter of a few years. 122 million rand of that went directly into the pockets of Gauteng Department of Health officials, and you'd expect more to have reached their pockets through indirect means. Easy loopholes in our procurement system were taken advantage of. For procurement over 500,000 rand, a tender process is required. But no problem, if you want to avoid that, you can just split orders below 500,000 rand. You can grease the right palms, and the purchase orders in Gauteng Health will be signed. Have linked companies put in quotes and rotate who gets the winnings, and you have what looks like a competitive 3-quote system. If you want a contract to deliver medical equipment or surgical supplies, but you're not registered with the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority as required, also no problem. Anyone with a cleaning or a security or another shelf company can just put in a quote. You don't need experience, you don't need storage space. All you have to do is pay the right person, and it seems you'll get a contract. If you're non-compliant with SARS or other basic requirements, also don't trouble yourself. There's someone at Gauteng Health, it seems, who will send you a compliance certificate for a fee, well, not for free. The SIU found that officials at all levels were involved in this scam. Management, clerks, a nurse, and people at head office. The report says, and I quote, "The rot was not only at the top, as commonly believed, but also deeply embedded in the root." News24 has established that Tembisa Hospital told the CFO at the hospital that there was a need to conduct a further investigation into certain suppliers and that she feared for her life shortly before she was murdered. The CFO, according to News24, said that she'd referred the matter to the HOD but hadn't, in fact, done so. The CFO was then suspended, as was the Tembisa Hospital CEO, and the CEO has now died. The Gauteng Health HOD has also now been suspended in the second SIU investigation he's been implicated in. It's difficult to believe that no other senior people at Gauteng Health noticed a year-on-year doubling of medical supplies expenditure at Tembisa Hospital, doubling from one year to the next. The hospital was spending more than Charlotte or Barra, and yet apparently only Babita, a GDOH, saw it. The Premier and Gauteng government are trying to spin the SIU's findings to show the extent of collaboration between Gauteng and investigators and to suggest that it is cleaning up bad apples. The Premier's office said, "We remain steadfast in our commitment to root out maladministration and to uphold the highest standards of accountability and ethical leadership." Unfortunately, this is neither the first nor will it be the last instance of rampant corruption in Gauteng. Before Tembisa, of course, there was the PPE scandal, in which then MEC Bandile Masuku was fired after an SIU report found that he failed to exercise the required administrative oversight regarding PPE contracts in the province. Dr. Masuku was not himself found to have committed any crime, but he failed to take the necessary steps when crime was being committed in his department, according to the provincial government. He's now in the Gauteng provincial legislature. The Anglo Gold Ashanti Hospital in Gauteng was donated to the province and was then meant to be upgraded for COVID. 50 million rand was initially estimated to be the cost of the upgrades, and 600 million rand was paid. The hospital was never opened. The Premier said after the scandal, "We remain committed to ensuring a transparent and clean government that is prudent in handling resources entrusted to it." Sound familiar? And then, of course, before that was the case of Brian Hlongwa, who was at the MEC and was implicated in 1.2 billion rand losses due to corruption in his time as Health MEC, including allegedly awarding contracts irregularly and at inflated prices to his friend. His corruption trial is set to start in April 2026, an astonishing 20 years after the corruption allegedly started. So why does this keep happening in Gauteng? Gauteng Health gets around 20% of the government's health spend, about 67 billion rand a year. And that is, of course, the first reason. Gauteng Health is a huge political and financial prize. Just adding the few numbers that I've spoken about today, we know that around 4 billion rand has been lost to corruption, about 6% of the Gauteng Health annual budget. And that's just from some of the well-known cases. That amounts to around 14,500 registered nurses' annual salaries. 14,500 registered nurses could be paid for that amount, or 1/3 of what the whole country spends on fixed-dose combination of ARVs, which is the medicine that most people living with HIV take. These numbers are galling because not only do we know that this is just a sample of what is being lost within Gauteng Health to corruption, but also because, as I speak, people are being turned away from health facilities in the province by vigilantes who say that South Africa's health sector does not have the resources to serve everyone who lives here. And as we near the end of the financial year, we'll see once again clinics having to wait for contraceptives and hospitals for surgical supplies because the budget has run out. The theft of so much health money has direct consequences for patient care and for rights realization. We allow the care of pregnant women and surgeries to restore health and dignity to be traded for Lamborghinis and luxury properties. The AG's latest audit of the national and provincial departments of health found that while there have been some improvements in most provinces, including Gauteng, there were common areas of non-compliance. These were procurement and contract management, quality of financial statements, expenditure management, effective consequences, revenue management, asset management, utilization of conditional grants, strategic planning, and transfer of funds. The AG marked provinces against these areas. Gauteng Health was the only provincial department of health with issues in all of these areas, according to the AG. So despite decades of corruption scandals, the systems have not been put in place to prevent corruption, and this doesn't feel like mere oversight. And the fact that there's scandal after scandal also demonstrates that the problem isn't just bad apples. The problem, I would suggest, is threefold, and we need to resolve each of these issues. First, of course, there's the lack of systems development and implementation to prevent corruption and mismanagement. Nothing has been put in place to reduce the likelihood of the corruption that we've seen in the past 15 years in the future. The amount below which a hospital can rely on just quotes rather than formal bids was increased to 1 million rand from 500,000 rand. This means there's a black box for procurement, which could be opened by the Gauteng Department of Health or provincial leadership if it wanted to do so, but it has chosen not to. Given that this is such a clear area of threat, we cannot allow the lack of transparency over procurement, including so-called smaller procurement, to continue. There also doesn't appear to have been any additional whistleblower protection instituted. People come to us and to others in civil society and the media to talk about what is happening in hospitals and clinics, and they are terrified. Many don't come at all. Most don't come at all, because Babita's murder was a clear warning, and nothing has changed to prevent a repeat of for the next whistleblower. The internal audit function seems to be overlooked, and so instead there's a reliance on the SIU and law enforcement, which will always take longer to investigate and make findings, by which time the money will likely be gone. We rely on law enforcement, which is currently itself on trial, rather than on prevention. Corruption has to be prevented, not just responded to. Law enforcement is not enough, and prevention needs to be and can be built into systems. And that's the first thing we need to do. The second is a lack of accountability. The AG's reports describe the main problems in health departments as being stock control, project management, lack of consequences for poor performance of contractors, for poor performance within the human resources, lack of implementation for internal control, lack of consequence management when internal controls are not happening. So much of that is about accountability. It's taken 20 years for Brian Hlongwa to potentially be brought to trial. It's taken 2 SIU investigations for the HOD to be suspended. It's 3.5 years since Babita Deokaran was killed. And after the initial arrests, everything has gone quiet. And those who ordered what are clearly hitmen for the job have not been arrested. In the Life Esidimeni case, in which 144 people were killed by what Justice Moseneke called an admittedly delinquent provincial government, it's taken an ombuds investigation, an arbitration, an extensive police investigation, an inquest, many millions of rand of taxpayers' money to fund the defenses of implicated people, a significant portion of the resources of Section 27 in representing families, and a decade of waiting for those families. And the NPA is still considering prosecution. While Life Esidimeni wasn't a case of the kind of corruption that is discussed here, it was a glimpse into an institutionally corrupt department, one in which the functions of the department were turned against those it is meant to serve. In that case, the MEC and a senior official have been found on the face of it to have caused the deaths of 9 mental health care users, and yet they've faced no personal consequences. And of course, we must note that it's not just criminal accountability that we need to give attention to, but also employment, professional, political, and social accountability too. Justice Moseneke found in his arbitration award in the Life Esidimeni arbitration that Ms. Mahlangu, and I quote, acted with impunity, thinking she will get away with murder because the users and their families were vulnerable and poorly resourced. And yet she remained on the Gauteng PEC and went for a walk with the president. Others, as I said, have kept teaching at the ANC's Oliver Tambo Political School or served on parliamentary portfolio committees after what should have been their fall from grace. It seems that there's an unspoken rule that the stolen money can be pursued, but not the people who stole it and not the people who caused deaths. And the third thing that I think we need to deal with is the terrible lack of good leadership. There's something horribly wrong when a province that should have it easier than most to attract and retain the best people can barely hold on to a head of department for more than a year. Whether the reason is the MECs they serve under, the complexity of the system, the entrenched problems, or something else, the reasons need to be established and resolved. Are we not listening to people who have tried to do the job and haven't left amidst a scandal? Are we not putting in place the measures that are needed to make it possible for them to run the province? Or are we just choosing the wrong people based on allyship rather than what the job needs? One of the significant contributors to the failures in Gauteng Health has been the blurring of lines between political and administrative leadership. The question of adequate independence was dealt with by the Constitutional Court in Venester 2, where the court held that independence does not require insulation from political accountability, but only insulation from a degree of management by political actors that threatens to stifle independent functioning and operations. So it's about keeping management of a department out of the realm of politics. Such independence is actually legislated in the National Health Act. The Act gives clear roles to the MEC and the head of department. The PFMA specifies the weighty obligations on any head of department as an accounting officer. But politics in Gauteng seems to have overridden the law time and again, and it's had disastrous consequences in doing so. Health leadership, whether that's MECs or HODs or hospital managers, are acknowledged to be vital to the success of a system. They're one of the pillars of universal health coverage. It's referenced time and again in all of our literature and all of the policy documents as a success factor in other middle-income country health systems. We talk about it constantly, and yet we're not getting it right. And I think this also leads us to consider the often mooted idea of national intervention under Section 100 of the Constitution, which is talked about a lot when we see how much failure of leadership there's been at the Gauteng health level. This section of the Constitution provides for national executive intervention when a province cannot or does not fulfill an executive function under the Constitution. The intervention can take the form of a directive telling the province what it's doing wrong and how to fix it, or national government can just come in and assume responsibility for the province's obligations. And in theory, Section 100 is a powerful safety switch. But in practice, what's meant to be a temporary intervention is often prolonged and open-ended, we've seen. There's no enabling legislation that ensures that national administrators can do what is needed to turn a province around, including hiring and firing or applying appropriate dedicated resources. The Monitoring, Support and Intervention Bill, which was meant to do just that, has been in draft form since 2013, but it's never been brought to Parliament. And also, as it stands, the capacity within the national department to step in and run a failed province is limited. National intervention is a tool, but not a particularly effective one at this stage. And because of that, leadership problems need to be resolved at provincial level, and that requires diagnosis of the problems that may be contributing to the years-long failures, holding people to account for their political or administrative failures, and appointing the right people in the first place. Getting systems, accountability, and leadership right is vital because, as I've said before, corruption and a lack of accountability have direct consequences for health. We have to put the right to health at the center of the health system, because the health system isn't just an industry. It's not just a bureaucratic machine. It's a system that's designed and is meant to realize the constitutional right of access to healthcare services. And as Alicia Eliyamin describes health, it's perhaps the most radical of subjects for human rights, because more than any other topic, it challenges the boundaries of what is natural. There can be no right to be healthy, but much of population health is subject to social control through laws, policies, and programs that influence exposures and mitigate effects. Our health system is meant to be doing something radical, keeping people healthy and productive and capable of living a fulfilled life, of getting an education and of realizing their potential. It's the foundation of so much of the potentially transformative power of the Constitution. A health right in itself means little without a system to support it. And so the right to health requires that we adopt an understanding of the health system as a core social institution. Because acknowledging the right to health as central to a health system makes that system better. It requires that we put in place the leadership, programs, budget, checks and balances required to realize the right and attain the societal and individual benefits of realizing that right. And of course, it's also not just the right to health that requires a health system that meets the needs of the people, but Section 195 of the Constitution that requires that public administration be people-centered, development-oriented, and accountable, and that people's needs must be responded to. It is this people-centeredness that must inform the way that the health system works. This should be obvious in a country that so often touts its progressive constitution, but the reality of what it takes to make constitutional rights mean something seems to evade the imagination of many of our leaders. The right to health has to mean more than putting Batupele posters in clinics, displayed but often ignored. It means making sure contraception is available to all. It means making sure that women are able to access safe abortions. It means ensuring that when vigilantes are trying to block access to services for people they don't think should be able to access them, that the health system and its leadership steps in to prevent that blockade. It means treating human rights not just as principles, but as directives. Because if the right to health is to mean anything, if we're to take seriously the opportunity and indeed the obligation to use the health budget to improve people's health and lives and enable everyone to reach their potential, we have to tackle the weak leadership, the lack of accountability, and the corruption that continues to scourge Gauteng health. I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. I am opening the floor for questions. I'm not sure if people can raise their hands, but if you can, please feel free to raise your hands. And then we will recognize you and enable your microphone. Alternatively, there's a Q&A option where you can type out a question and then I will ask the question for you as well. So those are the two options. But while we wait for people to do that, I've got a few questions of my own. So Sasha, as a lawyer myself, I think about these questions a lot, but in different contexts. And I just wonder, from a legal perspective, is what we need more law or do we need more implementation of the law? Because I'm trying to work out, particularly in relation to corruption and accountability, often we're told we need more legal regulation, we need to amend particular statute for this to be effective, etc. So in your view, in particular, in the particular context of the right to health, and in the particular instances that you mentioned, do you think that we need more law, or would your policy proposals work through, say, the development of a kind of coherent departmental policy, both at the national level and at the provincial level?
Yeah, thanks, Anya. I think the answer is really, as it often is, one of implementation of the law and putting systems in place in line with the law. What we often find is that the law can be clear, can be coherent, but there's neither day-to-day implementation nor is there sort of understanding of what obligations the law places on people at a local level, and so that needs to be translated and implemented locally. Much of this is not actually that complicated. Really, what it requires is the political and administrative will to take the steps necessary to hold people accountable in a way that is appropriate. And we're just not seeing that. We're seeing various processes reaching a certain point. In some cases, the return or retrieval of funds that have been lost, but we're not seeing the next step. And as I said, it's not just about criminal accountability. Certainly, that's only one piece of the puzzle, but it's about people being held to account for what they're doing so that others can see that it won't be accepted in the department anymore. And that is where we're seeing the real deficit, where people are recycled around departments, where there's no individual accountability or responsibility, and where the message is loud and clear, and that is, we're not going to take action. So as long as you don't get caught, you can carry on as is.
Thanks for that. That sort of takes me to a question that's been posted in the Q&A, but also something I've been thinking about. So the question in the Q&A is from Jackie Howard, who says, what can a citizen do to hold leaders to account beyond voting? And that also connects with, it's sort of follow up to what you said. When we talk about accountability outside of criminal accountability, what do we mean? So when you say you want people to take, not you, when we say we want to hold people to account, what do we mean? What does that look like? Thanks.
I think it's important that we keep the pressure up on those who need to take the steps to hold people accountable. So as an ordinary citizen, you can't suspend or dismiss or institute an investigation into somebody at the Gauteng Department of Health who is taking payments in order to allow contracts to go through. But what we can do is keep pressure up on the politicians and the administrators. And that's in some cases through the media. If you look at the Babita Deokaran case, so much of it has been pushed forward thanks to the investigative work of News 24. If you look at the Life Esidimeni case, without families demanding justice over many years, without their allies like Section 27 and the South African Depression and Anxiety Group and others, we wouldn't see the level of accountability we've seen so far. So I guess it's for ordinary citizens, it's partnering with those who are pushing, and it's not allowing these matters to go out of the news, because I think we are at risk when so much is happening. We're at risk of moving from one scandal to the next. But when we look at just four scandals, four corruption-related scandals in Gauteng over the last 15 years, and the amount of money that has been lost due to those corruption scandals, and what could have been done with that money, we see how important it is to keep all eyes on these disasters, and to remind everyone of what rights impact they in fact have, because corruption isn't victimless, and a lack of accountability isn't victimless, and we're going to continue being the victims of these crimes and these actions until we force accountability.
Thanks, Sasha. There are two questions in the Q&A, and maybe we've got a little bit of time, so maybe you can take them one by one. I'm going to start with Tracy Lynn Field's question. Is there a single one-stop point where one can know who the implicated HODs and MECs were, say, since 2010?
Strangely, no. When I was preparing for this webinar, I did as much digging as I could. Spotlight has published has part of a list, so you can have a look at Spotlight NSP. If you look them up, you can see some of this list. But it's actually quite difficult to get a complete list of who all of the HODs and MECs have been over the past 15 years, and which of them were implicated in corruption and other scandals. I've put together a basic list for myself that I'd be happy to chat with you about, but I do feel that I've missed some names. So it's surprisingly difficult to get that list. And I was really astonished to see the massive delay in the Brian Hlongwa trial, which was started. I mean, what happened in that case is that the former MEC was accused of having been involved in the awarding of contracts to a friend, essentially worth 1.2 billion rand. There was an SIU investigation into the complaint. That SIU investigation was given to the former president. It wasn't released by the former president. Section 27 and the TAC had to PIA that investigation report, and it was finally, after we'd PIA'd it, made public. That was about 8 years ago. So the time lag has just been astonishing. And then the trial was supposed to start, I think, in 2023 or 2022, and the latest is that it'll start in August 2026. So there's just such an enormous delay, and these matters go quiet if we don't keep attention on them.
Thanks, Sasha. You mentioned PIA. I was wondering whether that was something that a PIA request could be used to access these lists that you're thinking of. I don't know if you've already put one in.
Good point. We haven't, but I think it would be worthwhile doing that, not just to see who was implicated in what, but also what the turnover has been. Because even without corruption, the fact that the province has had so many MECs, and more troublingly, so many HODs within such a short period of time, shows the turbulence in the department and the difficulty in maintaining any kind of coherent program and that's particularly problematic given that the Gauteng health program gets such a huge chunk of the budget and is so important to so many people who live in this province. So I think knowing who's come through the department and why they've left is important, and maybe PIA is part of the answer to that.
Thanks. I want to change tack a little bit unless there are follow-ups to Erica Corneber's question. First, she says, thank you for the robust and shocking presentation of the Gauteng Department of Health corruption. And then she says, I'm wondering about your thoughts on the incoming NHI. The obvious concern is how the state will manage funds within a national health insurance system. However, the need for transformation within the health system is also apparent, and the NHI Act is underscored by the recognition of the UN mandate of universal health coverage. Do you think that the NHI holds any potential for transformation, or just widening the opportunity for corruption?
Thanks, Erica. Yes, I think the difficulty with NHI is that it does fall within government's broad approach to universal health coverage. It's supposed to make a clearly inequitable and deeply troubled health system more equitable, provide more access to more people, for more people to more services. And this aim is desperately needed. And we've been waiting for an increase in equity in the health system for a long time. And unfortunately, waiting and waiting and waiting, pending the passing of the NHI bill, which of course happened, was it last year, just before the elections, and there's been no promulgation of the act. There are some real concerns about governance and corruption under NHI. The main concern is that NHI envisages all funds sitting within what will be called the NHI fund. So all financing for health sitting inside one fund. And that fund will essentially act like a big global medical aid. So it'll be able to purchase services from providers in either the public or the private health sector, which in theory is great because it uses the resources from both sectors and it ensures equitable access to services for everybody. So it's not just based on what you're able to pay, but actually on what you need. The problem is the governance of the NHI fund, as it's laid out in the NHI Act, is extremely centralized. It's centralized in one person, and that's the Minister of Health. The Minister of Health appoints the ad hoc committee that shortlists members for the NHI board. The minister then, so they appoint the ad hoc committee. The ad hoc committee then gives recommendations to the minister for appointment of board members. The minister appoints those board members that he or she chooses to appoint. The minister appoints the chairperson of the board. The minister appoints the CEO of the fund. The minister also appoints advisory committees that advise the fund, and the minister has their own representative on each of those committees. So essentially, much of NHI governance is held in the hands of one person, which is systemically a really bad idea. There just isn't the kind of oversight that there should be. The only oversight that exists, that was introduced in the most recent version of the Act that was then passed, is to cabinet, but really that oversight doesn't give much comfort. So that's the one concern, and something that we and many others are arguing needs to change in order to protect the NHI fund from the possibility of corruption and mismanagement. The other concern is the real lack of transparency. So, at the moment, there's this problem with procurement under, it was 500,000 Rand, it's now under 1 million Rand, just being subject to three quotes rather than to a competitive bid system. And what I think Tembisa has showed us is that we need to have more transparency in that process, because it's too easy for things to go wrong when there isn't transparency. The NHI Act turns the health system into even more of a procurement system, because the NHI fund is going to contract with public or private hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, pharmaceutical companies, etc. So there'll be a lot of contracting, and there's not nearly sufficient provision for transparency within that contracting. That, I think, is a huge, huge risk, and one that we need to push back against, because I think it puts all health funds at significant risk of corruption. So, I mean, that's the difficulty, is that the NHI is intended on the one hand to do all the right things, all the things that we want it to do, But it's really important that we get the governance and the transparency mechanisms right, because if we don't do that, it can't achieve the equity that it's supposed to be intending to achieve.
Thanks, Sasha. I'm not sure if there are any follow-ups on this, but I was thinking, do you think that there's any other system in the world of universal healthcare that South Africa can consider as not a model, but can consider as a parallel in terms of actually doing what it sets out to do? Or do you think that all of them, or the ones that you're familiar with, are plagued with similar problems?
Well, there are problems in each system, of course, and some work better than others, and some might be more similar to South Africa's than others. In the early days of NHI, or in the early days of the discussion of how we were going to change our health system, there was more focus on looking at other examples around the world and thinking about how South Africa could lift positive examples from other countries. Unfortunately, there's been much less of that comparative work done in recent years, and much more digging into the ideology of NHI and batting away any kind of opposition to elements of NHI. And in some ways that's understandable, because there's been a lot of opposition and it's difficult to manage. But at the same time, I think we're missing the potential learnings of the last 12 or so years from other countries, both countries that have succeeded in implementing systems that move towards universal health coverage, and also learning from the mistakes that countries have made. Like, for example, Kenya has done some work on universal health coverage and have experienced problems with private sector managing to dominate much of the service provision, undermining the public sector. In South Africa, we have a huge public sector that is a real asset to us, and we need to work out, and many countries that have implemented universal health coverage haven't had that public sector and have been trying to work out ways to use the private sector. South Africa needs to harness its public sector as well as its private sector. And those are the kind of nuances that I worry that we haven't been looking at directly or clearly enough for the last little while.
Thanks, Sasha. I see that there are two more questions and comments in the chat, so I'm going to take you there. We're taking you all over the place today. Thank you for being so flexible in answering everyone's questions. So I see there's another question that's just been posted, but perhaps I'll start there. Would we need an independent, Amber Van Vincent says, would we need an independent healthcare institute that manages the healthcare system? And would we be independent of any political interference and have oversight?
So this has been a matter of so much debate whether something, for example, like the NHI fund could be within our legal system totally independent of politics. And there's a few, I guess your question could be read in two ways. There's the health financing element or the health service provision element. I think what's important is that we don't need a health system or health financing system that is entirely independent of politics, but it does need to be sufficiently independent of politics. That's what the Glenister judgment said. And so there is definitely a need for much more non-political or apolitical oversight. And there are ways that has been done in different places around the world to have that kind of independent oversight that isn't politically driven, or at least checks and balances on politics. As I said, one of our big challenges is this political administrative overlap, and the fact that politics has leached into the administration of health. And that's what we need, I think, to focus on separating. And the law is actually quite clear on that. And it's another area where we're just not implementing what the law says. So we do need more independence. It doesn't necessarily need to be entirely devoid of politics, but we need to do a much better job at separating the politics and the administration of health.
Thanks. The two questions in the chat actually relate quite a lot to what you said at the end, and I'm going to read out Darshan Naidu's comment and question, and then take you to Tracy Lynn's next question. So Darshan says, many thanks to Sasha for this brilliant and topical discussion. And the comment is, he says the elephant in the room, according to him, is the ruling party that has been in power for 31 years and has allowed for and participated in this corruption. And so long as they're able to maintain power, very little can be done to tackle this disease of corruption. So that's the comment, and that relates a little bit to what you said at the end. And the question that Darshan asks is, how can legal professionals and especially academics contribute to shaping more resilient healthcare governance in South Africa? And would you say that there are any research gaps? Since we've got just under 15 minutes, I'm going to ask you, Tracy Lins, as well, and then take whatever you like from that, putting you under pressure. And Tracy Lynn says, acknowledging the colleagues from the health sciences who are attending, how has this systemic corruption affected the medical profession? And what, in your experience, has been the effect of this corruption on young doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals?
I think on Tracy Lynn's question, perhaps the question is not for me, but more for the professionals themselves. And I can only say what I've seen from the health professionals that we speak to. And it's a huge amount of frustration and distress from many people, because they are the ones seeing the resource constraints at facility level, having to deal with those resource constraints, having to turn people away, knowing that there's something going on, but not always knowing what it is or what they can do about it. And then, as I said before, the real fear, if they want to raise their hand and say something's gone wrong, there's been some corruption or something untoward that's happened, the fear of what will happen if they do so. And of course, Babita Deokaran her murder is a particularly heinous example of what can happen, but there's also a lot of lower level sidelining, bad mouthing, exclusion that happens to people who stick their head up. And so so what happens is people stop talking, and I think that's really discouraging for people who've gone into the profession to serve. But I would also love to hear from the health professionals what their experiences have been, because I can only imagine it's been very difficult. When it comes to what legal professionals and academics can do to shape a resilient healthcare governance, to shape a more resilient health system, from Darshan, I think one of the strengths of South Africa's health system is there are so many people who are thinking about it and want to help. It's quite astonishing in that way. We work on health and on education, and when I look at the health sector and the health academia, the really smart work that has gone on, the attempts by academia to be involved in policy making, it's notable and it's impressive. I don't think there are, well, from what I've seen, I don't think there are big research gaps. I think that the challenge for all of us in the legal profession, and especially in academia, is to keep trying to get in the room, because we need to make sure that we're not sticking to our lanes. We need to make sure that the people who are thinking about health are able to influence policy and implementation, and many of those are within academia. And we need to get government to listen more to academia, but academics need to keep getting into the room, making sure that the research aligns with what is needed, and providing some of the solutions to some of the really tough questions that I think we have in the healthcare system. So I don't think there are gaps. It's mostly about speaking louder and getting a seat at the table with some solutions that can make the health system better, because there are a lot of good people working on this.
Thanks very much, Sasha. I'm waiting for more questions to be asked. I've got one of my own, but before that, I'd just like to say, if there are colleagues from the health sciences who would like to speak to Tracy Lynn's question or to contribute to the discussion, please feel free to raise your hand. I think your mics have all been enabled, so either post in the chat or raise your hand, and we would love your interventions and contribution to the discussion. I see. Have we got anyone who'd like to contribute? Do raise your hand if so. All right. So Sasha, from my side, we've got 10 minutes left, but my question really is, again, like taking it back to what law can do in the limits of law. I'm really thinking about legal institutions here. So a critique that's often leveled against not just South African civil society, but uh, for example, Brazilian civil society and the public interest sector, is that a court-first approach often leads to the realization of rights of the middle class rather than people who are the most vulnerable and marginalized. And here I'm thinking about Octavio Ferraz's critique of the right to health litigation in Brazil in particular. And so I was wondering how you saw the role of the public interest sector in relation to realizing the right to health, and in addition to that or through that, holding various governmental actors accountable. Do you think of a strategy that also works alongside government as well as holding government accountable through courts? What other institutions do you think have a role to play in all of this? Any reflections would be welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there is certainly a risk of over-reliance on courts to get to improve access to healthcare services. And as you say, that's been a real criticism of right to health litigation in Brazil, which for others who might not be aware, has been very active, but has largely been aimed at individuals accessing particular quite expensive medicine that is off the government list, essentially. And Brazil has a substantial public health system that caters to all. And so what happens then is there's no precedent set. It's not like everybody in the same situation can access those medicines. It just means that more money is spent on individuals. That is certainly a risk. It isn't the way that health litigation has developed in South Africa. Firstly, we don't have a courts first approach. We, in fact, very seldom, relatively speaking, approach courts because of all the work that civil society does to try and resolve problems before court. So we make submissions, we do rights education and awareness work so that people are able to express what their rights are and try and get assistance themselves at health facilities. We work with government on policy making. We conduct advocacy. We negotiate. We mediate. And sometimes when we need to, we litigate. But what you'll notice about South African public interest law litigation or public interest litigation on health and indeed in other areas is that it is very systemically focused. So we are seeking relief, not just for the individuals, but to improve the health system in general. There are always risks that by taking a case on tuberculosis, for example, it can bump diabetes down the queue. There's always that risk. But really the litigation has been, and the precedent has been set for systemic changes that improve the lives of everyone in similar situations and hopefully improve the healthcare system. So while there are risks to using courts, I'm not worried that we're at the brink of an era where courts have been overused. And I think that what courts have done so far is increase access to medicines, increase access to services, improve access to for example, emergency medical services or abortion. And I think that's the way we need to go to not just improve individuals' experiences, but improve systems, because we need strong systems in order for human rights to be realized generally.
Sasha, for that helpful reminder of our context and of the fact that there is a lot of work that's being done even outside of the court system. And in fact, access to courts or recourse to courts rather is something that happens only in the last resort. It's really helpful to understand how Section 27 approaches these questions and the various spaces in which the sector is involved. I see that we don't have any more questions. Now's your last chance, everyone, to raise your hand and ask Sasha a burning question. I see Albert and Jonathan have their hands up, so I'm going to take them both very quickly before I then hand over to you, Sasha, to have the last word, respond to the questions and have the last word. Albert, you can go first.
Thanks a lot. I think the focus of current discussions have been on the Tembisa scandal. My question is, maybe hypothetically or practically, what would trigger investigations across all the facilities in Gauteng? Because I don't think this is limited to Tembisa. But so far, the focus has been on Tembisa. And maybe even in other provinces, we might be having actually the same happening. And the key question becomes, what would trigger that expansive analysis of the situation across most of these facilities? Thank you.
Thanks, Albert. Jonathan, can we take your question? And then Sasha, over to you.
Sure. In a way, it can build on Albert's point as well. So, Sasha, thanks very much for that. I was looking at my favorite recent government document, which is the NACAC final report from the end of August, which proposes a whole raft of institutions and changes to the anti-corruption institutional architecture, as I know you know. And I was looking at it to see if it said anything about health. And you'll be a little disturbed. There's only 6 citings of the word in the report. It's really the question of, because you work in the health sector, is there something distinctive about the corruption in the health sector? And I guess building from Albert's, is it, because there are these big hospitals that can kind of become institutionally entrenched with corruption, or because they're, the kind of monies with drugs? Be very interested for what you think makes health distinctive, other than, as you said, the right to health perhaps underlying all the rights.
Thanks. Yeah, so Albert, I think you're right. There's absolutely no way that this is just Tembisa. There's no way. And there's also no way that it's just Gauteng, although it does seem that Gauteng is a hotbed of health-related corruption. I think what would trigger an investigation is transparency. And I think that's what we need to be demanding. It's not good enough that if a procurement, if something is required that's going to cost less than R1 million, it all can be done quietly without a competitive process. That's not to say that tenders work terribly well in preventing corruption, as we know, but it's really easy when they're under that procurement, that procurement ceiling. And so I think what's really necessary is for there to be transparency about all of the contracts being entered into. And I just don't see any reason for that not to be the case. If we can call for that loudly and allow the investigators and the journalists and others to get on the case, I think we will start uncovering a much bigger problem. And the SIU is doing an excellent job in investigating much of this corruption, but it can't do it alone. And I think we need more sunlight. Jonathan, what makes health corruption different? So I think it is largely, as I said, it's the size of the budgets and the amount of procurement that has to happen. There's just so much procurement that happens at hospital level and at district level and at provincial level and at national level. There are so many different items that can be described differently. And so you can very easily split contracts so that it looks like something different, but actually it's all the same thing. And it seems that the syndicates, as the SIU has described them, have really found their niche in health. SIUs recognize that health is particularly susceptible to corruption and has this health sector anti-corruption forum, and it just does seem that health is a particular target. And so I do think we need to be treating procurement in health particularly carefully. And certainly, given that we are now looking at NHI, we need to have our eyes very wide open to the risks of corruption in health.
Thank you so much, Sasha. This actually brings us to the end of today's session at 2 p.m. on the dot. So I really appreciate everyone's questions and your responses being perfectly timed. I see Tracy Lynn Field is still with us on the call. Tracy Lynn, would you like to have the last word?
Thank you, Sonia. Well, Outstanding. Thank you, Sasha. It was absolutely brilliant. Has just confirmed for me the importance of the Mandela Institute being more involved in this area of health because of its transformative potential. And interestingly, when one looks at the mechanism of capture and theft and the hurdles that are placed in the way of realizing human rights, this phenomenon of salami slicing, being just below the threshold, it comes across in mining, in procurements, in how you build private dams. So it's an interesting phenomenon to me, just to see it, but with concern now that it's raised to 1 million. So thank you so much. I do hope that our collaboration will continue. You really enriched us today, Sasha.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for your rich questions that really drove the discussion. Appreciate it a lot. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.